You know someone like this? They are kind-hearted, principled, always seeing the best in others. They live by a moral code that seems almost unshakable in today's world. They believe in honesty above all, in keeping every promise, in helping anyone who asks. They talk about integrity and virtue as if they're the only currency that matters. But beneath this admirable exterior, you've noticed something troubling. They get exploited repeatedly. Their goodness becomes a target. Those with fewer scruples manipulate their principles, use their kindness as a weakness. They refuse to play politics at work and watch as less qualified, but more strategic colleagues rise above them. They lend money that's never returned, trust people who betray their confidence, extend themselves for others who never reciprocate. Maybe they're your colleague, maybe your sibling, maybe your closest friend, someone who, despite their intelligence, seems blind to the darker realities of human nature. An idealist in a world that punishes idealism, perpetually surprised when others don't live up to their standards, always hurt, yet never adapting. And maybe, just maybe, part of you still admire their purity while wondering if it's sustainable. Niccolò Machiavelli observed this human pattern centuries ago, this dangerous devotion to being good in a world that isn't. It is the archetype of the person who confuses virtue with effectiveness, morality with strategy, who believes that goodness alone is sufficient armor against the world's harsh realities, who enchants with their moral clarity, their ethical certainty, their unwavering principles. But there is a shadow behind this virtue, the inability to navigate power, protect oneself, or achieve meaningful goals in a competitive world. The person devoted solely to goodness expects the world to reward virtue for its own sake, that right actions will naturally lead to right outcomes, that morality and success are perfectly aligned. And when reality does not match this fantasy, they feel betrayed. They become bitter. They give up, yet never question their approach. Machiavelli called this moral naivety the greatest weakness of leaders and individuals alike. The fatal flaw that has brought down kingdoms, collapsed businesses, and ruined countless personal lives throughout history. He saw that goodness without power becomes impotent, kindness without boundaries becomes exploitation, honesty without discretion becomes vulnerability, when in fact, these people are paralyzed by their inability to reconcile what should be with what is. If you have ever tried to protect someone like this, you know how frustrating it is. You grow tired of warning them about manipulative colleagues, of advising caution they ignore, of watching them extend trust to those who have repeatedly proven unworthy. And the cruelest part? They make you feel cynical, as if you were corrupted for seeing the world as it actually operates, for suggesting they occasionally prioritize effectiveness over purity. But the truth needs to be said. This person you know is trapped in a moral framework that, while beautiful in theory, fails catastrophically in practice. And if they don't awaken to Machiavelli's insights, they will continue suffering while paradoxically preventing the very good they wish to create. This video is not advocating immorality. It is offering clarity. And if you're watching this far, it's because something inside you recognizes this pattern. Perhaps in someone close. Perhaps even in yourself. The journey toward effective goodness doesn't require abandoning morality, but it does demand understanding power, strategy, and human nature without flinching. Let's examine what Machiavelli really meant. Machiavelli's wisdom is not about celebrating cruelty or abandoning ethics. It is about understanding the mechanics of power in an imperfect world. His masterwork, The Prince, written in 1513 while in exile from Florence, was not a manual for tyrants, but a clear-eyed assessment of how influence actually operates. The context matters. Machiavelli lived in Renaissance Italy, a landscape of constant political turmoil where principalities rose and fell, where foreign powers invaded regularly, where survival required more than good intentions. From this crucible emerged his most controversial insight, that conventional morality can become a liability when divorced from pragmatism. It is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain himself to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge or not according to the necessity of the case. This statement shocks us precisely because it strips away comforting illusions about power. Machiavelli recognized that humans respond more to incentives than ideals, to consequences rather than principles. And now you've seen this dynamic play out in your own life. The workplace where the most competent isn't promoted, but rather the person who understood the unwritten rules. The relationship where endless forgiveness merely enabled further mistreatment. The negotiation where revealing all your cards up front left you at a disadvantage. These aren't aberrations or injustices. They're the predictable outcomes of ignoring how humans and systems actually function. Machiavelli distinguished between the commendable qualities we admire in individuals: generosity, compassion, honesty, and the qualities that produce successful outcomes in competitive environments. The gap between how people actually behave and how they ought to behave is so great that anyone who ignores everyday reality in order to live up to an ideal will soon discover he has been taught how to destroy himself. This isn't cynicism, it's clarity. The person who cannot distinguish between how the world should work and how it does work becomes ineffective at creating any good whatsoever. They become martyrs to ideals rather than agents of positive change. They sacrifice real-world impact on the altar of moral purity. The essential Machiavellian insight is that power itself is morally neutral, a tool that allows your values to manifest in reality. Without power, your virtues remain private consolations while the world is shaped by those willing to engage with its harsher realities. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. There is something unsettling about Machiavelli's perspective that resonates even 5 centuries later. He strips away our comfortable illusions about virtue and its rewards. He forces us to confront the gap between our moral ideals and the mechanisms of success. And this confrontation is precisely what makes him essential. Because the shadow side of goodness is not just ineffectiveness. It's the gradual corruption of the very ideals it claims to uphold. The person who begins with pure intentions, but repeatedly fails to achieve their goals, eventually becomes cynical. Their initial goodness curdles into resentment. Their faith in humanity sours into contempt. This is the cruel irony. Those who refuse to understand power often end up more spiritually damaged than those who engage with it honestly. You've witnessed this transformation. The idealistic colleague who, after years of being overlooked, becomes bitter and disengaged. The trusting friend who, after repeated betrayals, withdraws completely rather than learning discernment. The ethical business owner who, unwilling to make necessary but difficult decisions, watches their company fail, taking with it all the good they might have done. Machiavelli saw this pattern playing out across history. Leaders who refused to engage with reality lost not only their positions, but the very causes and kingdoms they cherished. Their virtue became the vehicle of its own destruction. Behind the apparent ruthlessness of Machiavelli's advice lies a deeper moral concern. Effectiveness matters. Results matter. Impact matters. A leader who maintains moral purity while their state collapses has failed their most fundamental responsibility. A person who maintains perfect honesty while being manipulated into destructive situations has abandoned practical wisdom. The person devoted solely to virtue paradoxically enables vice to flourish around them. They create power vacuums that are filled by those with fewer scruples. And in this failure, they become unwitting accomplices to the very evils they oppose. Machiavelli's greatest insight wasn't about politics. It was about human nature. He observed humanity without illusion, without romanticism, without wishful thinking. And what he saw was profoundly consistent. Human beings are fundamentally self-interested, inconstant, and reactive to immediate circumstances rather than abstract principles. Men are quick to change their minds, especially about good, he wrote, but it is easy to persuade them of something, but difficult to keep them persuaded. This psychological realism forms the foundation of all his political advice. The Machiavellian view recognizes that humans respond to incentives, not ideals, to what benefits them, not what should benefit them. People praise honesty but reward cunning. They admire generosity but exploit excessive giving. They celebrate mercy but respect strength. This gap between stated values and actual behavior creates the central challenge for anyone trying to be both good and effective. In Machiavellian thought, virtues and vices aren't absolutes, but relative to their consequences. Generosity that bankrupts a state becomes destructive. Mercy that encourages crime becomes cruelty to victims. Honesty that reveals strategic weaknesses becomes foolishness. He introduces the concept of necessity, as the governing principle for when to adhere to conventional virtue and when to depart from it. The wise person understands that context determines whether a traditionally virtuous action produces virtuous outcomes. Her critical Machiavellian concept is fortuna, fortune or chance, which he personifies as a formidable force in human affairs. Fortune is a woman, he famously wrote, and it is necessary, if you wish to master her, to conquer her by force. This metaphor, while jarring to modern sensibilities, conveys his essential point. Passive virtue is insufficient. Active engagement with unpredictable circumstances requires preparation, boldness, and adaptability. Those who expect fortune to reward their goodness are inevitably disappointed. The pure-hearted person who refuses to engage with Machiavellian realism is not just naive. They're allowing their fate to be determined by forces they refuse to understand or confront. They surrender agency in the name of principle. And in doing so, they often surrender the very principles they sought to uphold. In Machiavelli's world, power isn't something to be avoided by good people. It's something to be understood, cultivated, and directed toward worthy ends. Because without power, virtue remains an unfulfilled promise. There comes a moment when the idealist must confront a harsh truth. Pure virtue without strategic thinking leads to failure. Dreams without power remain dreams. Good intentions without tactical wisdom become regrets. And then, the person committed to both moral ends and practical effectiveness faces the essential question. How can I remain good while acknowledging the world as it is, not as I wish it to be? This is the breaking point. The moment when the pain of ineffectiveness becomes greater than the comfort of moral simplicity. The birth of what we might call the virtuous pragmatist. Machiavelli did not advocate abandoning morality for expedience. He advocated understanding the chessboard of human affairs with clarity. The lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves. This famous metaphor reveals the essence of Machiavellian wisdom, the capacity to shift approaches according to circumstances without losing sight of ultimate goals. The first step is accepting reality without resentment. It is understanding that human nature, power dynamics, and strategic thinking are not evil. They're neutral tools that serve whoever masters them. That navigating them skillfully is not moral compromise, but moral obligation. It means recognizing that effectiveness is an ethical imperative if you truly care about your values manifesting in the world. But this acceptance requires mourning. The mourning of simplistic moral frameworks. The mourning of the belief that good intentions guarantee good outcomes. The mourning of the comforting illusion that you can remain pure while engaging with an impure world. This mourning gives birth to a more mature approach, one that holds tension between ideals and reality. Being both principled and strategic requires tremendous internal discipline. It means developing discernment about when transparency serves your aims and when discretion is necessary. It means cultivating power not for its own sake, but to protect and advance worthy goals. It means understanding reputation management not as deception, but as essential to long-term effectiveness. The virtuous pragmatist recognizes that consistency in ends matters more than consistency in means. That calculated compromises in method can serve uncompromising values. That moral purity that leads to practical failure ultimately serves no one. This is the essence of Machiavellian wisdom properly understood, not as an abandonment of virtue, but as its sophisticated application in a complex world where power matters. If you have made it this far, it is because something inside you recognizes the urgency of what has been said. Perhaps you've seen this pattern in someone close to you. Maybe you've seen yourself in every word, and there is no shame in that. None. Because all of us, to some degree, carry the temptation to believe that good intentions alone are sufficient in a world that demands strategic thinking. We have all clung to moral simplicity when faced with complex situations, trusted blindly when discernment was needed, and hoped that virtue would be its own reward when reality demanded more. But the truth is simple and challenging. The world does not reward goodness automatically. It responds to power, strategy, and understanding. And sooner or later, you will be confronted with the choice to remain trapped in ineffective idealism or cross the bridge to principled effectiveness. This crossing happens not when circumstances are perfect, but when you decide, with courage, that your values deserve more than private satisfaction. They deserve real-world impact. Machiavelli said that the first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. Similarly, we might judge our own wisdom by examining whether our approach to goodness produces actual good in the world or merely preserves our self-image as good people. The person who refuses to engage with Machiavellian insights doesn't preserve their virtue. They abandon their responsibility to make virtue effective. They allow the field of action to be dominated by those with fewer scruples and greater strategic clarity. Effective goodness is born when you stop expecting the world to naturally reward your virtues and start developing the skills to make those virtues matter. When you understand that power isn't inherently corrupting but is necessary for meaningful impact. When you realize that strategy isn't inherently manipulative but essential for navigating human complexity. And now I want to hear from you. Which Machiavellian lesson impacted you the most? Comment down below. Be honest. Sometimes, writing is the first step to giving shape to what you felt. And if this video made you reflect, share it with someone who needs to hear this. Someone who struggles with the tension between ideals and effectiveness. And it doesn't stop here. The next video is just as important as this one. It will show you another essential philosopher whose wisdom complements Machiavelli's insights. Keep watching. It may challenge you, perhaps, but it will empower you. And in the end, that is what matters. Real impact in an imperfect world.